Ready. I want to talk for a few minutes about the religions in Israel. I said we're going to land on the ground and it's going to look like that one picture from American Pickers where it's all confusion. And you're going to see a welter of religions and all kinds of religious symbols all jumbled together. So let me help to Frank and Mike you and unpack these a little bit to make it a little clearer. Let's start with Judaism, and it's really Judaisms, because there are a variety of ways of practicing Judaism in this little country. 40% of the Jews in Israel would be described as secular, which means they don't practice Judaism. Half of those don't even believe in God. If you talk to a Jew who is an atheist or agnostic, it won't be long before the Holocaust comes up. It's very difficult for the Jewish mind to comprehend how there can be a God who would allow 6 million of them to be killed. And so the Holocaust has been very devastating in terms of the Jewish religion in maintaining a belief in God. So 40% of the Jews that we would see in Israel would be secular, not practicing their religion, and many of them not believing in God at all. 23% would be what we would call traditional Jews. Now, these would be Jews that keep kosher somewhat. What do we mean by kosher? Kosher means there are certain foods and certain practices that one must observe in order to be a faithful Jew. So, for example, there's a passage, actually there's 3 times in the Old Testament law where it says, don't boil a goat in the milk of its mother. Now, we don't know why that appears 3 times in the Old Testament law, but obviously it was an important thing. Some speculate it had something to do with some pagan practice, but we don't know. But over the course of time, that Mosaic rule, don't boil a goat in the milk of its mother, has become don't serve meat and milk at the same meal. Don't do what I did one time and ask the waitress to bring butter for my roll, because we had meat on the menu. Now, a traditional Jew would pay attention to that kind of thing. A traditional Jew would support the idea, which we'll find when we get there, that every day, if you're in an elevator, every day of the week, you push the buttons, except on the Sabbath. They're automatically wired to run and stop at every floor on the Sabbath. And you say, why is that? Well, Exodus 35 says, don't light a fire on the Sabbath. And over time, that rule has become don't do anything that ignites a spark or creates any kind of an electrical connection, like what happens when you push a button on an elevator. So a traditional Jew would be observant of that kind of thing for the most part. And then there would be the religious Jews, about 10%. The religious Jews would be observant more so than the traditional, but they would be somewhere between the traditional and the last group, which are the ultra-Orthodox. Now, these are the ones that you probably recognize. The ultra-Orthodox Jews, let me show you a picture of them. Have you seen individuals like this? The long sideburns, typical for Jewish men who are ultra-Orthodox. Haredi is the way the term that's used to refer to them. The Haredi Jews are a very small percentage of Israeli society, as I said, about 8%. But they hold a significant amount of power. This is a group that's growing. Right now it's 80%. It's anticipated to be as much as 20% by 2028. Large population growth. They are the ones who are responsible for ensuring many of these religious rules in a population that's 40% secular. Every elevator runs the way I've described. And this is because of the influence of the ultra-Orthodox. So you will see them everywhere, and they exert a lot of power. Right now, the hot question, in fact, this is the picture that I showed you, These young men are gathered because they are protesting the possibility that they would then have to fight in the war. They would have to join up with the military. Right now, they're exempt from the draft, the Haredi, so long as they continue their religious studies. But the Israelis are debating whether or not to allow them to continue and require them to be part of the draft, and these young men are protesting that. So, for the Jews, we have these groups. Their holy book is the Hebrew Bible. It's what Christians consider the Old Testament. They call it the Bible. Their holy day is the Sabbath, and it's the seventh day, which begins sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. And their place of worship is the synagogue. The second group are the Muslims. They're part of the second largest religious group in the world after Christianity. Islam is an Arabic word that means surrender or submission. And of course, they're talking about submission to Allah, which is the Arabic word for God. Even Arabic Christians refer to their God as Allah. That's just the Arabic word for God. This is monotheistic and based on the teachings of Muhammad, the prophet, who lived 570 to 632 AD. Muhammad is considered not a god. That would be blasphemous to say to a Muslim. Muhammad is the last and greatest of the prophets. But if I told you the names of other great prophets in Islam, you would recognize them. Men like Abraham, Moses, Noah, David, Jesus is considered a prophet. My wife and I were visiting in Pennsylvania, and we ate a meal opposite a mosque known as the Jesus and Mary Mosque. What Islam has done, it's taken up Judaism in a large degree and Christianity in a large degree and represented itself as the fulfillment of where these two other monotheistic faiths were pointing. And so as you hear them talk about Christianity, they believe that Christians are people of the book. So they're similar in some ways, but of course, because we believe in a Trinity, we've totally missed the point, according to the Muslims. There's only one God. There are 5 what are called pillars of Islam. There's 5 key things about Islam. The one is the Shahada. This is the statement of faith that's very brief. It goes something like this. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is the Shahada. And this is recited regularly. If you want to become a Muslim, you recite this from your heart in Arabic in front of 3 Muslim witnesses, and that's what it takes to become a Muslim. There is the Salat, which is the daily prayer done 5 times a day. And while we're there, we'll hear the call to prayer. It comes very early in the morning. It might wake you up. And the Muslims turn to prayer 5 times a day. Zakat is a alms or a tax paid for the poor and needy. Som is a fast that's done in the month of Ramadan, which moves throughout the calendar, but you probably have Muslim friends or acquaintances or neighbors who don't eat until sundown during Ramadan. And then Hajj. If you're able, once per your life, you're encouraged to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is the holiest site in Islam. The scripture for Muslims, the holy book, is the Quran, delivered to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. There are denominations within Islam. There are Sunnis, there are Shiites, and there are a number of other denominations. It has to do in part with who is the legitimate successor after the death of Muhammad. Most of the Muslims that we will meet would be Sunni Muslims. Their holy day is Friday, but morning to evening, and this is a time for special prayer. In fact, the Quran says this, "O you who have faith, when the call is made for prayer on Friday, hurry toward the remembrance of God and leave all business. That is better for you, should you know. And when the prayer is finished, disperse through the land and seek God's grace, and remember God greatly so that you may be felicitous. And for the Muslims, the place of worship is the mosque. This last one might sound familiar to you. Christianity, 2% of the population. 60% of these would be Greek Catholic. 30% would be Greek Orthodox. And then about 10% would be a conglomeration of everybody else, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, other Orthodox, Protestants. Ethnically Arab. Politically, probably would be in agreement with the Arab Israelis in terms of their view about Israel. Religiously, probably not as religious as the Muslims, but more so than the Jews. Their holy book, of course, is the same as ours, the Old Testament, New Testament. A number of these would have other books, what we know as the Apocrypha. And of course, Sunday is when they worship, and church is where they worship. All right, so that finishes up our first section.